Every other Bronze Age civilization is dead. Egypt is a theme park. Babylon is rubble under Iraqi sand. Greece is a memory filtered through Rome, which is itself a memory filtered through the church. The Hittites, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, names in textbooks, pottery in museums, languages no one speaks. But China is still here. Same writing system, same family names, same bureaucratic instincts that make a government official in Beijing today recognizable to a Han Dynasty administrator from 2,000 years ago. A farmer in rural Sichuan can burn paper money at his grandfather's grave, using rituals that were ancient when Rome was young. The continuity is so obvious that people stop noticing it. They shouldn't. China has fallen apart more times than any other civilization. Invaded, conquered, fragmented, burned. Foreign armies have sacked its capitals repeatedly. Civil wars have killed tens of millions. Dynasties have risen and collapsed with the regularity of seasons. And yet it keeps reassembling itself. Same shape, same center, same weight. Not because it was stronger than the others. Not because it was better defended. Because it had something they didn't. A story about what China is that survives, even when China doesn't. This is that story. How a collection of Bronze Age river kingdoms became the longest continuous civilization in human history. How they built an empire, lost it, rebuilt it, lost it again, and kept rebuilding it for 3,000 years. And how the formula they invented, the formula for holding an impossible amount of land and people together, became both their greatest achievement and the trap they could never escape. To understand what China became, start with what it wasn't. 1,200 years before Christ, there was no China. The word didn't exist. The concept didn't exist. There was a river valley, the Yellow River, thick with silt, prone to catastrophic floods, and scattered along it were Bronze Age kingdoms that shared a writing system and not much else. They traded with each other, fought each other, married into each other's royal families, and considered everyone beyond their borders to be barbarians. People who didn't cast bronze, people who didn't write, people who didn't perform the proper rituals to honor the dead. The most powerful of these kingdoms called itself Shang. Its kings ruled from a capital near modern Anyang, and they had a technology no one else possessed, a direct line to the spirit world. The Shang talked to their ancestors, not metaphorically, literally. They would take a tortoise shell or an ox bone, carve a question into it, heat it until it cracked, and read the pattern of cracks as a message from the dead. Should the king go to war this month? Will the harvest be good? Is the queen's child a boy? The bones answered, and the king obeyed. Over 150,000 of these oracle bone fragments have been discovered, and they are the oldest Chinese writing we have. Not primitive scratches. A fully formed script with thousands of characters, already sophisticated, already capable of recording complex thought. The questions are mundane sometimes. Will the king's toothache get better? Other times they're brutal. Should we sacrifice 30 prisoners or 50? The answers were inscribed, and often the actual outcome was recorded too. A civilization keeping receipts on its conversations with the dead. The Shang built things that still stagger. The Simuwu Ding, a bronze ritual vessel cast in one piece, weighing nearly 2,000 pounds, required a level of metallurgical skill that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. Their tombs held hundreds of sacrificed humans, some decapitated, some buried alive, servants and soldiers sent to serve their masters in the afterlife. This was sophisticated and savage in equal measure, rich beyond imagination and soaked in blood. The textbooks call this ancient Chinese civilization. That's propaganda written backward from the present. There was no Chinese civilization, not yet. There were river valley kingdoms with good bronze and a lot of bodies in the ground. What turned them into China wasn't culture or language or shared ancestry. It was conquest. Around 1046 BC, the date is disputed, but the event is not. A frontier. People called the Zhou marched east and destroyed the Shang dynasty. They killed the last Shang king. They took his capital. They claimed his territory and his legitimacy and everything that had made Shang powerful. The Zhou had a problem. They were conquerors, and everyone knew it. The Shang had ruled for centuries. The Shang had talked to the ancestors. The Shang had the bronze and the rituals and the bones. Who were the Zhou to take their place? They needed a story. So they invented one. They called it the Mandate of Heaven. Heaven, Tian, was not a god in the Western sense, not a bearded figure on a throne. It was a moral force woven into the fabric of the universe, a cosmic order that rewarded virtue and punished wickedness. And heaven, the Zhou claimed, had granted them the right to rule, the mandate. Here was the genius. The mandate was conditional. Heaven gave it, and heaven could take it away. A good ruler kept the mandate through just governance. A bad ruler lost it. And how did you know if a ruler had lost the mandate? Because he lost power. The proof of losing was the losing itself. This created a loop that would run Chinese politics for 3,000 years. Every successful rebellion was retroactively justified. Every fallen dynasty was retroactively condemned. The winners were righteous because they won. The losers were wicked because they lost. It was circular, self-fulfilling, and devastatingly effective. The Zhou didn't just claim this, they wrote it down. They recorded why the Shang had fallen. The last Shang king, they said, was a drunk and a monster. He tortured his ministers with hot irons. He made lakes of wine and forests of meat for his orgies. He ignored the suffering of his people, while his favorite concubine laughed at the screams. Every detail was calculated to prove that heaven had no choice but to revoke the mandate. Was it true? Almost certainly not, or at least not entirely. It was propaganda, but it set the template. For the next 3 millennia, every new dynasty would tell the same story about the one before. They became corrupt. They became cruel. They lost the mandate. We are the correction. The script never changed because it never needed to. The Zhou produced a man who understood what they had built. His name was Dan, the Duke of Zhou, and he served as regent for his young nephew after the first Zhou king died. He could have taken power himself. He didn't. Instead, he spent his regency creating the moral architecture of Chinese governance. The ruler must be virtuous. The ministers must be loyal. The hierarchy must be maintained. Father over son, husband over wife, ruler over subject, because the order of society mirrored the order of heaven. 500 years later, a teacher named Confucius would worship the Duke of Zhou as the model of the perfect statesman. 2,000 years after that, Chinese bureaucrats would still invoke his example. The man who didn't take power became more important than most of the men who did. This was the moment the formula was born. Not the conquest. Conquests happen everywhere. The formula was the justification, a legitimacy system that explained both why you deserved power and why you would eventually lose it. Every emperor who came after ruled under this sword. Every rebel who overthrew an emperor reached for this blessing. For the next 3,000 years, Chinese history would be driven by 4 forces. The mandate, the question of who heaven favors today. the order, the Confucian system of hierarchies and examinations, and bureaucratic virtue that would try to make governance rational and predictable. The frontier, the endless pressure from the northern steppe, the nomad horsemen who could raid and conquer and sometimes be absorbed, but never fully defeated and never fully ignored. And the peasants, the 90% who farmed and paid taxes and died in silence, until they didn't. And these four ingredients would collide and recombine across 100 generations. They would build empires and tear them down. They would absorb foreign conquerors and survive foreign ideas. And they would never, not once, produce a stable equilibrium. That was the trap hidden inside the formula. It was brilliant enough to unify the largest population on Earth. It was not brilliant enough to keep it unified. The Zhou system held for about 3 centuries. Then it cracked. In 771 BC, nomads from the northwest, aided by disgruntled Zhou lords, sacked the royal capital. The king was killed. His successor fled east to a new capital, and the dynasty continued in name. Only in name. The regional lords who had theoretically owed allegiance to the Zhou king stopped pretending. They were warlords now. They just hadn't admitted it yet. What followed was 500 years of war. The textbooks break it into 2 periods with gentle names. The Spring and Autumn period from 722 to 481 BC. The Warring States period from 475 to 221 BC. The names sound poetic. The reality was slaughter on a scale the ancient world had rarely seen. In the Spring and Autumn period alone, historians count 170 recorded wars. By the Warring States period, the dozens of independent states had been consolidated into 7, not through diplomacy, not through marriage, but through annihilation. The strong ate the weak until only the strongest remained. The population may have fallen by half. Entire cities were massacred, armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. A new weapon, the crossbow, made individual skill irrelevant and mass conscript armies possible. Any peasant could be trained to pull a trigger. Any peasant could kill a noble. The old rules died with the old aristocracy. But catastrophe creates pressure, and pressure creates innovation. Every surviving state became a laboratory. New ways to organize armies, new ways to collect taxes, new ways to motivate soldiers and terrify enemies. The kingdoms that couldn't innovate didn't survive long enough to be remembered. This chaos produced every major school of Chinese philosophy, not despite the violence, because of it. Every thinker was asking the same question. How do we survive this? How do we build a society that doesn't collapse into blood? Confucius lived in the middle of it. Born in 551 BC, died in 479 BC, a minor official from a minor state who spent his life wandering from court to court, offering advice that no ruler wanted to hear. His message was conservative. Return to the ways of the early Zhou. Restore proper ritual, proper relationships, proper hierarchy. If names are not correct, he said, language will not be in accord with truth. If language is not in accord with truth, affairs cannot be carried on to success. The disorder of the world reflected the disorder of hearts and minds. Fix the hearts, fix the minds, and the world would follow. He died obscure. His students gathered his sayings and wrote them down. It would take 300 years for his ideas to become state orthodoxy. 300 years for a failed teacher to become the most influential thinker in Chinese history. Others drew different lessons. In the state of Qin, poor, peripheral, considered barely civilized by the Eastern kingdoms, a political theorist named Shang offered advice that rulers actually wanted to hear. Forget virtue. Forget tradition. Forget kindness. The world is war, and the state exists to win wars. Every subject is either a farmer producing grain for soldiers or a soldier consuming it. Rewards for military success, punishments for everything else, no exceptions, no mercy. Qin adopted his system. Within a generation, it was the most feared state in China. Shang himself was eventually executed by a Qin king, torn apart by chariots, but his methods outlived him. The machine he built kept running. By 250 BC, only 7 states remained. Everyone knew what was coming. One would swallow the others. The only questions were which one and how much it would cost. The 500 years of war had forged every tool an empire would need. The philosophy of order, the technology of control, the justification for power, the armies and the bureaucracies, and the systems of measurement and law. All the pieces were on the board. What was missing was someone ruthless enough to use them all. He was coming. His name was Yingzheng, king of Qin. 13 years old when he took the throne, 38 when he finished what his ancestors had started. In 221 BC, the last rival state surrendered, and for the first time in history, everything from the northern deserts to the southern jungles, from the eastern sea to the western mountains, was ruled by one man. He needed a new title. King wasn't enough. There were kings everywhere, petty warlords with delusions of grandeur. He combined 2 ancient words for divine rulers and called himself Huang, emperor. Then he added one more word, shi, first. He was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, and his dynasty would rule for 10,000 generations. It lasted 15 years, but those 15 years changed everything. The first emperor did not simply conquer. Conquest was the easy part. Qin armies had been grinding down rival states for generations. What he did was standardize. He took a patchwork of kingdoms with different laws, different measurements, different currencies, different writing systems, and made them identical. One script. The 6 regional variations of Chinese writing were abolished. From now on, every literate person in the empire would read the same characters, write the same characters, think in the same visual language. And this is not a small thing. The Roman Empire never achieved it. Europe never achieved it. China did it in a decade, and it stuck for 2,000 years. The writing system you see on signs in Beijing today is descended directly from what Qin scribes carved into bamboo. One measurement. Weights and measures were standardized across the empire. A bushel of grain in the north was the same as a bushel in the south. A foot was a foot everywhere. Trade became possible at scale because trust became possible at scale. You didn't need to know the merchant. You just needed to know the numbers matched. 1 axle width. This seems absurd until you understand the roads. The empire was building roads, thousands of miles of them, and the roads had ruts. If every cart in the empire had the same axle width, every cart could use the same ruts. Infrastructure became interoperable. The modern equivalent would be forcing every computer in the world to use the same operating system. Except Qin did it with wood and bronze and the threat of execution. And that was the key, the threat of execution. The first emperor ran the first totalitarian state, not in spirit, in practice. A network of officials reported on every district. Neighbors were required to inform on neighbors. Punishments fell on entire families if one member committed a crime. Internal passports controlled movement. The law was not a shield protecting citizens from the state. The law was a weapon the state used to control citizens. He built the wall. Not the Great Wall you see in photographs, that came later, but its ancestor. He connected and extended the northern fortifications of the conquered states into something approaching a continuous barrier. Hundreds of thousands of laborers were conscripted for the work. Tens of thousands died. Their bodies were buried in the foundations. The wall was not strength. It was an admission of permanent vulnerability. The nomads would always be there. The wall was how you lived with that fact. He burned the books. The exact scope is debated. Some scholars think it was more targeted than the legend suggests. But the symbolism is not debated. Texts that didn't serve the state were dangerous. Philosophy that questioned legalist principles was treason. Scholars who owned forbidden works were executed. According to later accounts, 460 of them were buried alive. And the first emperor wasn't just conquering territory, he was conquering thought. And then there's the army that guards him still. In 1974, farmers digging a well near Xi'an broke through into a pit. They found a soldier made of terracotta, then another, then another. Over 8,000 life-sized warriors have been excavated so far. Infantry, archers, cavalry, generals, each face individually sculpted, no two alike. An entire army, frozen in clay, standing guard over the first emperor's tomb for 2,200 years. The tomb itself has never been opened. Ancient texts claim it contains rivers of mercury flowing through a model of the empire, the ceiling studded with pearls to represent the stars. Modern soil tests have detected abnormally high mercury levels in the ground above. The texts might be telling the truth. This was not a man who thought small, and this was not a man who trusted anyone, including death, to stop his empire from continuing. But death stopped him anyway. In 210 BC, traveling the empire, still searching for the elixir of immortality his alchemists kept promising, Huang died far from his capital. His advisors panicked. They hid the body. They traveled with wagons of rotting fish to mask the smell while they schemed over the succession. They forged orders. They forced the heir to commit suicide. They placed a weaker prince on the throne as a puppet. Within 4 years, rebellion had consumed the empire. The Qin dynasty fell. The first emperor's eternal dynasty was over before his bones were cold. The lesson carved itself into Chinese memory. Unification works. Tyranny doesn't. The next dynasty would have to find another way. The wars that followed the Qin collapse were brief and brutal. Rival warlords carved up the corpse of the empire, fought each other for supremacy, and sorted themselves into winners and corpses. The winner was a man named Liu Bang. He was a peasant, not a noble, not a general, not a minister, a peasant. A village headman who had become an outlaw, then a rebel leader, then a king, and finally, in 206 BC, an emperor. He founded the Han dynasty, and the Han would rule for over 400 years. Liu Bang's genius was knowing what he didn't know. He couldn't read. He despised scholars, but he understood that he couldn't run an empire by himself, and he was willing to listen to people who could. His advisors told him the Qin had the right structure and the wrong methods, and keep the centralized bureaucracy, keep the standardized systems, keep the roads and the measurements and the script, but wrap it in something that didn't make everyone want to rebel. The Han formula was simple: Qin's skeleton with Confucian skin. Underneath, the machinery of control remained. Laws were harsh. Officials reported to the center. The emperor's word was absolute. But on top of that machinery, the Han layered a rhetoric of virtue, benevolence, and cosmic harmony. The emperor ruled because heaven approved, not because he had the biggest army. Officials were selected for their moral cultivation, not just their administrative skill. The examinations that had begun under Qin were expanded and formalized. if you could master the Confucian classics, if you could write elegant essays on ethics and governance, you could rise, regardless of birth. This was the operating system that would run China for 2,000 years. Legalist methods beneath Confucian decoration, the iron fist inside the silk glove, harsh enough to hold the empire together, soft enough that people didn't want to tear it apart. The Han expanded, south into what is now Vietnam, west into Central Asia, north against the nomadic Xiongnu, who had been raiding Chinese territory for generations. The early Han emperors tried diplomacy, sending princesses as brides to Xiongnu chieftains, buying peace with silk and gold. It didn't work. The Xiongnu took the gifts and raided anyway. Then came Emperor Wu. Wu of Han took the throne in 141 BC and held it for 54 years, the longest reign in Chinese history until the Qing Dynasty. But he broke the Xiongnu through relentless campaigning, pushing Chinese armies across the Gobi Desert into the heart of nomad territory. He conquered the Tarim Basin oases that controlled the trade routes west. He turned the Silk Road from a vague trickle of goods into an imperial highway. The Silk Road connected two worlds that barely knew the other existed. Han China had 60 million people, comparable to the Roman Empire on the opposite side of Eurasia. Roman gold flowed east, purchasing Chinese silk that senators' wives draped over their bodies. Chinese silk flowed west, so valuable it was sometimes worth its weight in gold. Neither empire had a clear picture of the other. To Rome, China was a rumor called Syrica, the land of silk. To China, Rome was a rumor called Dakin, a great empire somewhere beyond the western deserts. They were mirror images, the two anchors of the ancient world, connected by camels and merchants who knew them both. The Han built roads, not as famous as Roman roads, but just as extensive. They built canals. They maintained granaries that could store years of surplus grain, releasing it during famines to stabilize prices and prevent starvation. They ran a postal system that could carry messages across the empire in days. They took censuses so accurate that we know the Han Empire had 59 million registered inhabitants in 2 AD, and we can compare that number to earlier and later counts to track demographic change across centuries. By the time of Emperor Wu, the examination system was selecting officials through written tests on Confucian classics. This is not a small innovation. China was choosing its governing class based on standardized written examinations 1,300 years before Europe tried anything similar. The French civil service exams of the 19th century were explicitly modeled on Chinese practice. The idea that bureaucrats should be selected by merit rather than birth, that a peasant's son could rise to govern provinces if he could pass the test, this idea that we now consider obvious was not obvious. China invented it, and it worked. For 4 centuries, the Han formula held. Emperors came and went, some brilliant, some mediocre, a few disasters, but the system absorbed them. The bureaucracy kept functioning, the taxes kept flowing, the borders kept expanding. When the emperor was strong, he directed the machine. When the emperor was weak, the machine ran itself. That was the point. Build a system that doesn't depend on any single person being extraordinary. But that was also the weakness. By the 2nd century AD, the system was rotting. The pattern wasn't visible yet. It would take later historians to see it, to trace the same trajectory across dynasty after dynasty until the shape became unmistakable. But the pattern was there, and it went like this. A strong founder builds the system. His successors inherit stability. The golden age produces wealth, and wealth produces complacency. The bureaucracy that was selected by merit becomes hereditary. Officials find ways to get their sons appointed, their nephews promoted, their cousins into the examination schools. Land concentrates in the hands of great families while peasants lose their farms and become tenants, then vagrants, then bandits. The court fills with factions fighting over a prize that's worth less every year. The frontiers, neglected, start to crack, and then something breaks. In the Han's case, what broke was the peasants. The Yellow Turban Rebellion began in 184 AD. Its leader was a faith healer named Zhang, a man who had built a network of religious communities across the northern countryside. He promised a new age was coming. The Han had lost the mandate. Heaven itself demanded change. The blue sky under which the Han ruled was dying. A yellow sky would rise. His followers wore yellow scarves wrapped around their heads, and when Zhang gave the signal, hundreds of thousands of them rose at once. They weren't soldiers. They were farmers with improvised weapons fired by religious fervor and 3 generations of accumulated grievance, and they couldn't defeat a professional army in open battle. But there were so many of them, spread across so much territory, that the Han couldn't possibly track them all down. The court made a decision that would kill the dynasty. To crush the rebellion, they gave military authority to regional governors. Raise your own armies, the court said. Recruit your own soldiers. Do whatever it takes to restore order. The governors did. They crushed the yellow turbans, and then they didn't give the power back. Within a decade, the Han emperors were puppets. The regional governors had become warlords, and the warlords were fighting each other for control of the corpse. The last Han emperor was deposed in 220 AD. He lived out his life in comfortable captivity, while 3 rival kingdoms claimed his inheritance. Zhang died early in the rebellion, but his slogan survived. The azure sky is dead, the yellow sky shall rise. In this year of Jiazi, let there be prosperity in the world. The yellow sky didn't rise, the blue sky didn't die. What died was the Han, murdered by its own generals, abandoned by its own peasants. The first dynasty cycle was complete. Here is what the pattern teaches. China's greatest strength and greatest weakness are the same thing. The system works. The centralized bureaucracy, the examination system, the mandate ideology, the Confucian values. When they're functioning, they produce the most effective governance in the ancient world. An empire of 60 million people, administered by perhaps 30,000 officials, selected by written examination, coordinated by standard procedures, motivated by shared ideology. Rome had legions. China had paperwork. Paperwork scaled better, but the system depends on balance. The emperor must be strong enough to control the officials, but not so tyrannical that he alienates them. The officials must be honest enough to serve the state, but not so powerful that they become the state. The peasants must be prosperous enough to pay taxes, but not so burdened that they rebel. The frontier must be secure enough that the army stays small, but not so neglected that the nomads notice. Every one of those balances will tip, eventually. Every emperor will eventually be followed by a weak heir. Every bureaucracy will eventually become corrupt. Every tax system will eventually squeeze until the peasants break. Every frontier will eventually produce a crisis the center can't handle. The formula was a trap disguised as a solution. It could build an empire. It could run an empire. It could not prevent an empire from rotting. Every dynasty would learn this lesson for itself. Every dynasty would believe it had found the answer. None had, but the formula didn't die with the Han. It went underground, into the texts, the traditions, the habits of mind that made a scholar in Sichuan and a scholar in Shandong recognize each other as the same kind of person. The Han had ruled for 400 years. That was long enough to make their system feel permanent, even after the dynasty was gone. What came next was darkness. For the next 400 years, China would forget it had ever been whole. Kingdoms would rise and fall. Invaders would pour through the wall. Cities would burn. Populations would collapse. The bloodiest centuries in Chinese history were about to begin. And through all of it, the memory of unity would survive. A ghost that haunted every warlord's court, a standard that every pretender claimed to meet. The Han were dead. The idea of the Han was immortal. The question was whether that idea could ever become real again. The Han were dead. The idea of the Han was immortal. But an idea cannot collect taxes. An idea cannot garrison a frontier. An idea cannot feed 60 million people or hold together a territory the size of Europe. For the next 400 years, China would learn what happens when the formula fails and nothing rises to replace it. The Three Kingdoms period began in 220 AD, when the last Han emperor formally abdicated to a warlord named Cao Pi. The empire split into three pieces. Wei in the north, controlled by Cao Pi's family. Shu in the mountainous southwest. Wu in the wealthy southeast. Each claimed to be the legitimate successor to the Han. Each was lying. The real story of the Three Kingdoms isn't heroes. It's horror. The Chao family patriarch, Cao Cao, father of the first Wei emperor, has been the villain of Chinese popular culture for 1800 years. Plays, novels, operas, all portray him as a scheming traitor who betrayed the Han and drowned the empire in blood. The romance of the Three Kingdoms turned him into a monster. Generations of Chinese children grew up hating his name. The adult version is more complicated. Cao Cao was a butcher, yes. He massacred cities that resisted him. He drowned prisoners in rivers. He ruled through terror and manipulation and a political instinct that bordered on the supernatural. But he was also the most competent man of his generation, and competence mattered when everything was falling apart. He started with nothing. A minor official's son, clever with words, good with a sword, running a militia during the Yellow Turban chaos. He built an army. He crushed rivals. He conquered the entire north and nearly unified the country, stopped only by a naval disaster at a place called Red Cliffs, where his fleet burned and his southern campaign died. He never took the throne himself. His son did, after Cao Cao's death. The father was content to be king while the Han emperor lived as a puppet in his court. This is what made him a traitor in Chinese memory. He could have restored the Han. He chose not to. He chose power over loyalty, pragmatism over principle, and China has never forgiven him. But forgiveness is cheap when you're not the one watching your country burn. The Three Kingdoms lasted 60 years. The wars between them killed millions. The Yellow River Plain, the heartland of Chinese civilization, the breadbasket that fed the Han, was devastated. Population figures from this period are apocalyptic. The registered population of China dropped from roughly 60 million to perhaps 16 million. Some died in battle. More died from famine when armies trampled crops and irrigation systems collapsed. More still simply vanished from the tax records, fled to the mountains, became bandits, disappeared into the chaos. This was not a transition. This was collapse. The death toll proportionally exceeded the Black Death in Europe, exceeded the Mongol conquest that would come 1,000 years later. The Three Kingdoms period killed a higher percentage of the Chinese population than World War II killed of the global population. The romances make it sound exciting. The reality was watching your civilization commit suicide. Wei eventually conquered Shu in 263 AD. Then Wei itself fell to a coup in 265. The Sima family, Wei ministers, repeating what the Cao family had done to the Han. The new dynasty called itself Jin. The Jin conquered Wu in 280 AD. For one brief moment, China was unified again. The moment lasted 11 years. In 291 AD, the Jin imperial family tore itself apart. 8 princes fought a civil war for the throne that lasted 16 years and killed hundreds of thousands more. When the princes were finished slaughtering each other, and they had weakened the dynasty so badly that it couldn't defend itself against what came next. The northern frontier was open, and the people beyond the wall had noticed. The textbook version goes like this: barbarians invaded and destroyed Chinese civilization. Savage horsemen from the steppe poured through the wall, sacked the cities, killed the scholars, and plunged China into a dark age. The adult version is messier and more interesting. The barbarians had been inside China for generations. The Han and Jin dynasties had been settling nomadic peoples within the empire: Xiongnu, Xianbei, Qiang, Di, Jie, using them as soldiers, as laborers, as buffer populations on the frontiers. They were subjects of the Chinese state, living under Chinese law, paying Chinese taxes. Many of their leaders spoke Chinese, wore Chinese clothes, and served in Chinese armies. When the Jin collapsed, these peoples didn't invade from outside. They rose from inside. They were already there. They simply stopped obeying emperors who could no longer protect them or pay them. In 311 AD, Xiongnu cavalry sacked Luoyang, the Jin capital. They captured the emperor, made him serve wine at banquets dressed as a servant, then executed him. 5 years later, they sacked the secondary capital, Chang'an, and captured another emperor. The Jin court fled south across the Yangtze River and re-established itself in what is now Nanjing. They never came back. For the next 300 years, China was divided. The south was ruled by a succession of weak Chinese dynasties, constantly scheming, occasionally attempting to reconquer the north, always failing. The north was ruled by a parade of non-Chinese peoples who built kingdoms, conquered each other, collapsed, and were replaced by the next wave. Historians call this the 16 Kingdoms period, then the Northern and Southern Dynasties period. The names suggest order. There was no order. In one 70-year stretch, the North saw 8 different dynasties rise and fall. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Populations fled south or west or into the mountains. The bureaucratic machinery that had run the Han ground to a halt. The examination system stopped. The Confucian academies emptied. If you lived through this, and most people didn't, you wouldn't have known whether Chinese civilization still existed. The books were still there, the traditions were still remembered, but the system that had made China work was gone. And the mandate had become a joke. Heaven wasn't choosing anyone. Heaven seemed to have abandoned the field. Here is the reframe that changes everything about this period. The barbarian conquest wasn't destruction. It was transformation. The non-Chinese peoples who conquered the north faced the same problem every conqueror faces. How do you rule a population that outnumbers you 20-1, using a system you don't understand? They had 2 choices: stay separate and rule by force, which works for a generation or 2 before the garrison states collapse from exhaustion, or adopt the conquered people's methods, which works but costs you your identity. Most chose to adopt. The Xianbei rulers of Northern Wei provide the clearest case. By the late 400s, they controlled most of northern China. Their emperor, Zhou, he made a decision that horrified his own people. He would become Chinese. He moved the capital from the northern frontier to Luoyang, the ancient seat of Han and Jin emperors. He banned Xianbei clothing, language, and customs at court. He ordered his nobility to take Chinese surnames and marry Chinese families. He rebuilt the examination system. He patronized Buddhist monasteries that rivaled anything the Han had built. His own generals nearly revolted. His successors partially reversed his policies, but the direction was set. Within a few generations, the Xianbei had become Chinese, or rather, they had become something new. Not quite Han, not quite steppe, but a synthesis that could hold both identities at once. The conquest ran in reverse. The conquerors were conquered by the culture of the conquered. The barbarians didn't destroy Chinese civilization. Chinese civilization absorbed the barbarians and made them its own. In the middle of all this chaos, something strange took root. A foreign religion from India, carried along the Silk Road by merchants and monks, found fertile ground in the wreckage of the Chinese world. Buddhism shouldn't have worked in China. It taught that family attachments cause suffering, but Confucianism was built on family. It encouraged monasticism, but Confucianism demanded engagement with society, service to the state, production of heirs. It came from outside, but Confucianism was explicitly Chinese, rooted in Chinese history, validated by Chinese sages. But Buddhism offered something the Confucian tradition couldn't, an escape from the wheel. In a world of constant war, constant death, and constant uncertainty, the Buddhist message that suffering has a cure, that there is a path beyond this world of pain, resonated with millions who had nothing left to lose. By the 500s, Buddhism had transformed Chinese culture. Cave temples were carved into cliffs across northern China, the Longmen grottos, the Yungang caves, filled with thousands of Buddha statues, some of them 70 feet tall. Monasteries became economic powerhouses, accumulating land and wealth and tax exemptions that made Confucian officials nervous. Buddhist ideas about karma, rebirth, and compassion filtered into popular consciousness and never left. This was unprecedented. China had absorbed foreign peoples before. The Xianbei were only the latest example. But it had never absorbed a foreign system of thought at this scale. Buddhism was the stress test. Could the Confucian order incorporate something radically different and survive? The answer was yes, but only by changing both the foreign thing and itself. Chinese Buddhism developed its own schools, its own practices, its own relationship to family and state that looked very different from Indian Buddhism. Ancestor worship got folded in, filial piety got accommodated. The monasteries learned to bow to emperors. The emperors learned to patronize monasteries. By the Tang Dynasty, Buddhism would be one of the three teachings, alongside Confucianism and Taoism. No longer foreign, fully naturalized, part of what it meant to be Chinese. But that was still in the future. First, someone had to put the pieces back together. In 577 AD, a general named Yang Jian reunified the north under a single dynasty. In 589 AD, he conquered the south. For the first time in nearly 4 centuries, all of China was ruled by one emperor. Yang Jian called his dynasty Sui. He was careful and competent, rebuilt the bureaucracy, reduced taxes, and filled the granaries. By the time he died in 604 AD, he had created something that looked almost like the Han formula restored. His son destroyed it in 14 years. Emperor Yang of Sui is one of history's great cautionary tales. He was brilliant, ambitious, and catastrophically impatient. He completed the Grand Canal, a waterway over 1,100 miles long, connecting the rice-rich south to the wheat-hungry north, the greatest engineering project in medieval history. He rebuilt the capital into a monument to his own glory. He waged war against Korea, to launching 3 massive invasions to conquer a peninsula that had no strategic value and no interest in being conquered. The first invasion mobilized over 1 million men. It failed. The second invasion mobilized even more. It failed. The third invasion was cut short by rebellions back home, rebellions caused by the crushing taxes and conscription needed to fund the first 2 invasions. By 617 AD, the empire was fragmenting. Regional officials declared independence. Bandit armies roamed the countryside. Emperor Yang fled south to his pleasure palaces, surrounded by guards whose loyalty was already cracking. In 618 AD, those guards strangled him with a silk cord. The Sui dynasty had lasted 37 years. 2 emperors. One built a foundation. One burned it down. The pattern was old. The formula had worked once, failed once, and worked again under the Sui, and was now failing again. But something different was emerging from the wreckage. A new dynasty, founded by a Sui general who had been smart enough to rebel at the right moment, would take the Sui's infrastructure, learn from the Sui's mistakes, and build something that would be remembered as China's golden age. The dynasty called itself Tang. The Tang were not who you think they were. The standard narrative casts them as Chinese revivalists, pure Han culture restored after centuries of foreign contamination. The founders' names were Chinese. Their rituals were Chinese. Their capital was Chang'an, the ancient Han seat of power. Everything about their presentation said, "We are the real China, returned at last." The reality, the Tang imperial family was at least half Xianbei. They spoke Turkic as well as Chinese. They married Turkic princesses. Their army was built on steppe cavalry tactics. Their empire was less a restoration of the Han than a fusion, a hybrid dynasty that could speak to both the settled Chinese world and the nomadic frontier in their own languages. This hybridity was their greatest strength. Previous dynasties had tried to solve the northern frontier through walls, through diplomacy, through bribery. The Tang solved it by becoming part of both worlds. The second Tang emperor, Taizong, wasn't just emperor of China. He was also declared heavenly Khan by the Turkic tribes, a steppe title for a steppe lord. He could demand obedience from nomad chieftains in terms they understood because he was, in their eyes, one of them. Taizong was the emperor who made the Tang formula work, and he seized the throne by killing 2 of his brothers, personally, with his own sword, and forcing his father to abdicate. Then he spent the next 23 years being the perfect Confucian ruler, humble, wise, open to criticism, devoted to the welfare of his people. He surrounded himself with officials who told him hard truths. He built schools and expanded the examination system. He conquered Central Asia and broke the power of the Eastern Turkic Khanate. When he died in 649 AD, the Tang controlled more territory than any Chinese dynasty in history. Was the legend true? He controlled what got written about him. Historians working for his dynasty composed the official record. But the legend matters more than the facts, because the legend became the standard. For 1,000 years afterward, and every Chinese emperor would be measured against Taizong. Most fell short. The Tang at their peak ruled roughly 80 million people. Their capital, Chang'an, covered 30 square miles, larger than Rome at its height, larger than Constantinople, larger than any city the world had ever seen. Foreign merchants thronged its markets: Persians, Arabs, Indians, Koreans, Japanese. Foreign religions built temples, Zoroastrian fire altars, Nestorian Christian churches, Manichaean shrines alongside Buddhist monasteries and Taoist temples. The Tang court received embassies from the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. This was the center of the world, and everyone knew it. The examination system reached its mature form. Roughly 30,000 candidates sat for the exams each year. About 1% passed. The successful became the governing class, scholars who could write poetry, debate philosophy, and administer provinces with equal facility. The Tang exam system was harder to crack than Harvard Law School, and the stakes were higher. Pass, and you were set for life. Fail, and you went home to explain to your family why all those years of study had come to nothing. For 130 years, the formula worked. Strong emperors, competent ministers, expanding borders, filling treasuries. The through-line tension, the impossible burden of unity, seemed finally to have been solved. The Tang had cracked the code. They had found the balance between central control and regional flexibility, between Chinese tradition and frontier reality, between Confucian order and Buddhist spirituality. They hadn't. They had just delayed the reckoning. His name was Lushan. He was fat, charming, and spoke 6 languages. He could barely read Chinese, but he had a genius for making powerful people like him. The emperor found him amusing, a jolly barbarian who performed comic dances at court and called the empress mother. The empress found him useful, a loyal general who could be counted on to support her family's political schemes. By 755 AD, Lushan commanded 3 frontier armies and 180,000 of the Tang's best troops. He was a Sogdian Turkic general in a dynasty that had always relied on non-Chinese frontier commanders. There was nothing unusual about his position, nothing unusual about his power. What was unusual was what he did with it. On December 16th, 755 AD, Lushan rebelled. His armies marched south from the frontier. The Tang forces sent to stop him melted away, outmaneuvered, outfought, betrayed by their own supply lines. Within weeks, the rebels had taken the eastern capital of Luoyang. Within months, they were approaching Chang'an itself. Emperor Xuanzong fled the capital with his court. The column of refugees stretched for miles. The emperor, his concubines, his ministers, his guards, all the apparatus of the most powerful government on earth, running for their lives. On the road to Sichuan, at a place called Mawei Station, the imperial guards stopped marching. They blamed the emperor's favorite concubine, Yang Guifei, and her family for the disaster. Her cousin had been chief minister. Her influence had blinded the emperor to Lushan's treachery. Now the soldiers wanted blood. Emperor Xuanzong gave them what they wanted. Yang Guifei was strangled with a silk cord while the emperor watched. He would spend the remaining years of his life writing poetry about his loss, wallowing in self-pity, the most powerful man in China reduced to mourning a woman he had killed to save himself. The rebellion lasted 8 years. When it was over, the Tang still existed. The rebels had been crushed, and Lushan himself was murdered by his own son, and the movement fractured into competing factions that the loyalists eventually picked apart. The dynasty survived. But survival isn't the same as recovery. The numbers tell the story. Before the rebellion, the Tang tax registers recorded roughly 53 million households. After, they recorded 16 million. Some of that was deaths. Scholars estimate that the Lushan rebellion killed 36 million people, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, proportionally worse than World War II. But most of the missing households weren't dead. They were simply gone. fled to regions beyond imperial control, no longer counted, no longer taxed, no longer obedient. The Tang survived the way a boxer survives a coma. They were still standing. They weren't really there anymore. For the next 150 years, the dynasty limped along. Emperors reigned but didn't rule. Regional governors became hereditary warlords in all but name. The examination system atrophied. The central government's tax base shrank to a fraction of its former size. The Tang court retreated into poetry and theology and palace intrigue, while the empire they nominally ruled slid toward fragmentation. In 907 AD, a warlord finally ended the pretense. He deposed the last Tang emperor and founded his own dynasty. It lasted 16 years before being overthrown. The next dynasty lasted 4 years. The one after that lasted 3. China was entering another dark age. 5 dynasties would claim the mandate in the north over the next half-century. 10 kingdoms would compete in the south. The pattern was repeating itself: collapse, fragmentation, chaos, as if the 300 years of Tang glory had been an illusion, a brief reprieve before history resumed its grinding cycle. But something had changed this time. The formula that had worked twice, Han, then Tang, had revealed a flaw that couldn't be fixed. Both dynasties had fallen the same way: military power given to frontier generals who eventually turned that power against the throne. The problem wasn't moral decay or bad emperors, and the problem was structural. You needed professional armies to defend the frontiers. You couldn't afford to keep professional armies near the capital, so you stationed them far away, commanded by men you had to trust because you couldn't supervise them. And eventually, one of those men would realize that the emperor's throne was just another prize to be taken. The next dynasty would try to solve this problem. Their solution would create a new problem, one that would haunt China for 1,000 years. The Tang were gone. Something else was coming. And somewhere beyond the northern frontier, the horses were gathering. The Tang were gone. Something else was coming. And somewhere beyond the northern frontier, the horses were gathering. The dynasty that emerged from the chaos of the 5 dynasties period understood one thing with perfect clarity. The Tang had died because their generals had become more powerful than their emperors. Every reform, every institution, every decision of the new Song dynasty would be shaped by that lesson. Zhou Kuangyin was a general himself when he founded the Song in 960 AD. He knew how the game was played because he had played it. His own men had placed him on the throne in a coup so smooth it barely counted as violence. A month after taking power, he invited his senior commanders to a banquet. The drinks flowed, the atmosphere warmed, and then Zhou Kuangyin made his offer: retire, go home, take wealth, land, titles, marry your children into the imperial family, enjoy your remaining years in comfort and honor, but give up your commands, give up your soldiers, give up the power to do what you just helped me do. The generals understood. One by one, they agreed. Within months, Zhou Kuangyin had peacefully dismantled the military aristocracy that had torn China apart for 50 years. The regional commands were broken up. Generals were rotated constantly, never allowed to build personal loyalty with their troops. The army was subordinated to civil authority so completely that a popular saying emerged: "Good iron is not used for nails. Good men are not used for soldiers." It worked perfectly. For 300 years, no Chinese general would threaten the Song throne. No internal military coup. No Lushan-style rebellion. The problem that had killed the Tang was solved. The solution created a new problem. The Song couldn't defend themselves. The irony is bitter. And the Song dynasty presided over the most technologically advanced, economically productive, culturally sophisticated civilization on Earth, and they spent 3 centuries being humiliated by everyone with horses and bows. Consider what they built. Song China reached 100 million people, the first political unit in history to govern that many. Their steel production hit 125,000 tons per year by 1078 AD, a level England wouldn't match until the Industrial Revolution 7 centuries later. They invented paper money and used it at scale. They developed gunpowder weapons, fire lances, bombs, rockets. They created movable type printing. They built ships with watertight compartments and magnetic compasses that could cross oceans. The compass, gunpowder, printing, paper money. These are the technologies that created the modern world. The Song had all of them, used all of them, and still lost to cavalry charges. Because technology doesn't win wars. Organized violence wins wars. And the Song had deliberately made themselves bad at organized violence. The problem appeared immediately. When the Song reunified most of China, they couldn't take back the 16 prefectures in the northeast, the strategic passes through the mountains where the Great Wall ran. Those were held by the Khitan Liao dynasty, a non-Chinese power that had controlled the region since before the Song existed. The Song were born incomplete, their northern frontier exposed, the doorway to the heartland in enemy hands. They tried to take it back. They failed. Their armies, led by civil officials who read poetry better than they read terrain, marched north and were slaughtered. So the Song did what the Song did best. They negotiated. The Treaty of Shanyuan in 1005 AD established a pattern that would define Song foreign policy. Peace, bought with annual payments of silk and silver to the Liao, 200,000 bolts of silk, 100,000 ounces of silver, every year, forever. The Song told themselves this was clever. The payments were trivial compared to the cost of war. The money kept the peace. The economy could easily absorb it. They were right. The economy could absorb it. But paying enemies to not attack you teaches enemies that threatening you is profitable. And it teaches your own people that their government cannot protect them. Both lessons would cost the Song everything. In 1115 AD, a new people rose in the forests of Manchuria. The Jurchens had been subjects of the Khitan Liao, and they were done being subjects. Their leader, Aguda, founded the Jin dynasty and began conquering Liao territory with the ferocity of people who have been oppressed and are determined never to be oppressed again. The Song saw an opportunity. They proposed an alliance. Together, Song and Jin would destroy the Liao. The Song would get back their 16 prefectures at last. The Jin would get the rest. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The alliance worked. The Liao fell. And then the Jin looked south at the Song armies that had struggled to defeat a dying empire, and they saw what the Song really were: rich, soft, and defenseless. In 1125 AD, the Jin invaded. The Song capital of Kaifeng fell in 1127 AD. The Jin captured the Song emperor and his father. They captured 3,000 members of the imperial family. They captured the imperial archives, the treasury, the ritual objects accumulated over 160 years. They stripped Kaifeng of everything valuable and marched their prisoners north into captivity. The former emperors of China were put to work as stable hands. They died in humiliation, their graves unmarked. The Song dynasty survived, barely. A prince who had escaped the capital fled south and established a new court at Hangzhou, beyond the Yangtze River. This southern Song would last another 150 years, ruling the wealthy half of China, while the Jin ruled the north. But survival isn't the same as recovery. The Song had lost the heartland. The Yellow River Valley, where Chinese civilization was born, where the Shang had burned oracle bones and the Han had built their capital. All of it was gone. The truncated dynasty that remained was rich beyond measure, its capital Hangzhou possibly the largest city in the world by 1200 AD, its trade reaching Southeast Asia and India and beyond. None of it mattered, because something worse was coming. The Mongols did not conquer China for any strategic reason. They conquered China because they were conquering everything. Genghis Khan united the steppe tribes in 1206 AD and launched the most extraordinary campaign of conquest in human history. Within 50 years, his descendants ruled from Korea to Poland, from Vietnam to Persia. The Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire ever created, before or since. The statistics are almost impossible to process, and modern scholars estimate that Mongol conquests killed 40 million people, roughly 10% of the world's population at the time. Some regions lost half their people, others lost more. When the Mongols took a city that resisted, they had a policy: kill everyone, not as an atrocity, as a strategy. Cities that heard about the massacres surrendered without fighting. Terror was a force multiplier. China took 70 years to conquer. The Jin dynasty in the north fell first, ground down by campaigns that began under Genghis himself and finished under his successors in 1234 AD. The population of northern China dropped by half. Then came the south. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, decided to finish what his family had started. The southern Song had survived by hiding behind the Yangtze, a water barrier the steppe cavalry couldn't cross. Kublai built a navy. He recruited Chinese generals and Muslim engineers. He laid siege to the fortress city of Xiangyang, which controlled the middle Yangtze, for 5 years. Xiangyang fell in 1273 AD. The path to the Song heartland was open. The final campaign lasted 6 years. One by one, the Song cities surrendered or were taken. The last Song emperor, a child of 8, drowned in 1279 AD when the final Song fleet was destroyed in a naval battle off the coast of Guangdong. A loyal minister carried him into the waves rather than let him be captured. For the first time in history, all of China was ruled by non-Chinese who had no intention of becoming Chinese. The Mongol Yuan dynasty would govern China as one province among many, using systems borrowed from Persia as much as from Chinese tradition. The examination system was suspended for most of the dynasty. Chinese scholars were classified as a lower caste than Mongols and Central Asians. The bureaucracy that had run China for 1,000 years was sidelined. Here is the truth about the Mongol conquest that the traditional narrative obscures. It was not simply destruction. It was incorporation into something larger. And that incorporation transformed both China and the world. The Yuan dynasty connected China to the rest of Eurasia more completely than ever before. Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, made the Silk Road safer than it had been in centuries. Persian administrators worked in Chinese cities. Chinese engineers worked in Persian cities. Marco Polo, if he existed, if his account is real, walked the roads of an empire that stretched from Venice to Hangzhou. In the Black Death came along those same roads. Plague swept from Central Asia to Europe in the 1340s, carried by merchants traveling routes the Mongols had secured. The catastrophe that killed a third of Europe began in the interconnected world the Mongols created. The Mongols brought horror. They also brought connection. Both are true. The trade routes they opened would eventually carry European ships to Chinese ports. The technologies China had developed, gunpowder, printing, the compass, would flow west and revolutionize Europe. The Mongol century was a hinge on which world history turned. But for the Chinese who lived through it, these long-term consequences meant nothing. What mattered was the 89 years of foreign rule, the humiliation of being second-class subjects in their own country, or the collapse of the institutions that had defined Chinese civilization since the Han. The Yuan dynasty fell the way most dynasties fell: natural disasters, peasant rebellions, court dysfunction. By the 1350s, the Mongol government was rotting from within. Floods and famines ravaged the countryside. Rebel movements exploded across the south. The mandate of heaven, a concept the Mongols had never really believed in, was passing to someone else. The man who claimed it was born a peasant, orphaned by plague, reduced to begging as a child, then briefly a Buddhist monk before the rebellions gave him a path to something greater. His name was Zhou Yuanzhang. He would found the last native Chinese dynasty, and he would do something no emperor before him had done. He would try to make sure the Mongol nightmare could never happen again. The Ming dynasty that Zhou Yuanzhang founded in 1368 AD was deliberately, consciously, obsessively Chinese. Everything about it was designed to erase the Mongol century and restore what had been lost. No more Mongol clothing, Mongol customs, Mongol names. The examination system was restored and expanded to its largest scale ever. The bureaucracy was rebuilt according to Han and Tang models. The capital was moved south, then north again to Beijing, a city the Ming would transform into the greatest expression of Chinese imperial architecture ever built. And the wall. The Great Wall as we know it. The massive stone and brick fortification that stretches across northern China, visible from space, photographed by millions of tourists every year, is not ancient. It is Ming. The Ming rebuilt the northern defenses from the ground up, pouring more resources into wall construction than any previous dynasty. Watchtowers every few hundred yards, garrison forts at strategic passes, a statement in stone that the northern frontier would never again be breached. Zhou Yuanzhang himself was the most paranoid ruler in Chinese history. He had risen from nothing. He trusted no one. He purged his officials repeatedly. Tens of thousands executed in multiple waves, often on evidence so thin it would be comic if the body counts weren't real. He banned political factions. He created a secret police that answered only to the emperor. He personally designed punishments for officials who displeased him, sometimes beating them to death in open court. He also created a stable government that would last 276 years. The Ming formula was simple: control everything, and the emperor would be the center of all authority. The bureaucracy would be watched by secret police. The military would be confined to garrisons, never allowed to concentrate power. The borders would be closed. Foreign trade would be restricted. Foreign ideas would be treated with suspicion. China would be China, pure, isolated, eternal. For 70 years after the founding, this fortress mentality seemed to work. The Ming conquered the Mongol remnants. They stabilized the frontiers. They rebuilt the economy. And then, briefly, they looked outward. Zheng Hu was a Muslim eunuch who served the third Ming emperor, Yongle. Between 1405 and 1433 AD, he commanded 7 massive naval expeditions across the Indian Ocean. His fleets were the largest the world had ever seen, over 300 ships, over 27,000 men. His flagship was 400 feet long, with 9 masts, larger than anything Europe would build for another century. He reached Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, East Africa. He brought back giraffes and zebras for the imperial zoo. He established diplomatic relations with dozens of kingdoms, He demonstrated that Ming China was the greatest power on earth, capable of projecting force anywhere it chose. And then it stopped. The Mongol emperor died. His successors looked at the expense of the voyages, the ships, the men, the resources, and saw waste. They looked at the sea and saw distraction from the real threat, the northern frontier. The expeditions were canceled, the records were destroyed, the great ships were left to rot. The voyages would have been useless anyway. There was nothing across the ocean that China needed. No trade goods worth the expense, no threats requiring naval power. The ocean was irrelevant. The steppe was everything. This was rational. It made perfect sense given what the Ming knew about the world. The Mongols had come from the north. Every major threat in Chinese history had come from the north. Pouring resources into walls and garrisons was sensible. Building ships to sail to Africa was vanity. The decision made sense at the time. It just happened to be the decision that meant Chinese ships wouldn't be waiting when European ships finally arrived. The Portuguese reached the Chinese coast in 1513 AD. They came with cannons and commercial ambitions. The world had changed while China was looking the other way. The Ming Dynasty lasted until 1644 AD. It fell the same way dynasties always fell. Famines, plagues, peasant rebellions, a court paralyzed by factional fighting, an emperor who hanged himself from a tree in the imperial garden as rebel armies approached the capital. But this time, the pattern played out differently. A Ming general guarding the northern frontier, a man named Wu Sangui, faced an impossible choice. Rebels held Beijing. Manchurian armies were massing beyond the wall. He could fight one enemy or the other, but not both. He opened the gates. The Manchus poured through. They took Beijing. They proclaimed a new dynasty, the Qing, and spent the next 40 years conquering the rest of China. By 1683 AD, the last Ming resistance had been crushed. China was under foreign rule again. The old pattern said the Manchus would become Chinese within a generation or two, absorbed by the culture they had conquered, and the old pattern was partly right and partly wrong. The Qing dynasty would rule for 268 years, longer than any native Chinese dynasty except the Han. They would expand Chinese territory to its greatest extent ever, absorbing Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang. They would master the Chinese bureaucracy, the Chinese examination system, the Chinese ideology of the mandate of heaven. But they would never quite become Chinese, not completely. They maintained their separate identity, their separate language, their separate military organization. They forced Chinese men to wear the Manchu hairstyle, the queue, with its shaved forehead and long braid, as a mark of submission. They were simultaneously the most successful Chinese dynasty and a permanent foreign occupation. The formula had worked one more time, and the system reassembled itself. The mandate passed, the bureaucracy resumed, the cycle continued, but something had shifted. The world beyond China's borders was transforming in ways no Chinese dynasty had ever faced. European ships with European cannons were probing Chinese ports. European empires were conquering Asian neighbors. European ideas about science, technology, and governance were remaking the planet. The Qing looked outward and saw what previous dynasties had seen: barbarians at the edges of civilization, relevant only as threats or as tributaries. They didn't see what was actually there: a global transformation that would break every assumption Chinese civilization had been built on. The longest continuous civilization in human history was about to face a test it was not designed to survive. The longest continuous civilization in human history was about to face a test it was not designed to survive. For 2,000 years, the formula had held. Dynasty rose, dynasty fell, dynasty rose again. The bureaucracy adapted, the examination system selected. The mandate passed from hand to hand. Invaders came through the wall and were absorbed by the culture they conquered. The cycle turned and turned and turned, and China remained China. The formula assumed one thing, that China was the center of civilization, surrounded by peoples who had nothing to teach it. This assumption had been true, or true enough, for most of recorded history. The steppe nomads had military skill, but no system of governance that could match China's. The kingdoms of Southeast Asia were influenced by Chinese models. Japan and Korea borrowed Chinese writing, Chinese philosophy, Chinese institutions. Europe was a distant rumor. In 1839, British warships appeared off the coast of Canton and demanded that China open its ports to trade. The Qing dynasty refused. The British opened fire. The First Opium War lasted 3 years. The outcome was never in doubt. Chinese war junks, wooden boats with cannons lashed to their decks, faced British steamships with artillery that could fire accurately at a mile. The Chinese lost every naval engagement. They lost every siege. They signed a treaty surrendering Hong Kong and paying an indemnity so large it would take decades to repay. 20 years later, the British came back. This time they brought the French. When the Second Opium War ended with foreign armies marching into Beijing and burning the Summer Palace, the vast complex of gardens and pavilions that had been the Qing emperor's private retreat for generations. The looting went on for days. Bronzes, porcelains, silks, scrolls, treasures accumulated over centuries were carted off to museums in London and Paris, where they remain today. This was not the steppe peoples coming through the wall. This was something the formula had never encountered. A fundamentally different civilization with technologies China didn't possess and ideas China couldn't absorb by making them Chinese. For the first time in 3,000 years, China was not the teacher being imitated. It was the student being forced to learn. The century that followed broke something in China's self-understanding. On the Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864, a millenarian uprising led by a man who believed he was the brother of Jesus Christ, killed somewhere between 20 and 30 million people, possibly more. The death toll exceeded World War I. It was the bloodiest civil war in human history, and it happened because the Qing dynasty was too weak to prevent it and almost too weak to stop it. The Sino-Japanese War of 1895 was worse in a different way. Japan, which had learned its writing system from China, which had modeled its government on Chinese precedents for 1,000 years, destroyed the Chinese fleet and seized Taiwan in a matter of months. The student had surpassed the teacher. The humiliation cut deeper than any military defeat. By 1900, foreign powers had carved China into spheres of influence, and German troops patrolled Shandong. French troops patrolled the south. Russian troops occupied Manchuria. The Qing dynasty still existed, still collected taxes, still staffed its bureaucracy with examination graduates. But everyone knew the dynasty was dying. The only question was what would replace it. In 1912, the last emperor abdicated. He was 6 years old. His name was Puyi, and he would live long enough to become a gardener in the People's Republic, the boy who had been worshipped as the son of heaven, pulling weeds in a Beijing park. The dynasty system was over. The mandate of heaven, the legitimacy technology that had run Chinese politics since 1046 BC, was officially dead. No new emperor claimed heaven's favor. No new dynasty tried to restart the cycle. For the first time in 3,000 years, China would have to build something else. What came next was chaos on a scale that made the three kingdoms look peaceful. Warlord fragmentation, Japanese invasion, civil war between nationalists and communists, World War II, more civil war. By 1949, when Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic from the gate of heavenly peace, China had endured over a century of continuous crisis. The Communist Revolution explicitly rejected everything the imperial system had stood for. The examination system was abolished. Confucianism was denounced as feudal poison. The landlord class that had provided the scholar officials for 2,000 years was destroyed. Mao's Cultural Revolution sent educated youth to farms to learn from peasants, an exact inversion of the Confucian order, where peasants were supposed to learn from scholars. The old system was dead, deliberately killed, its textbooks burned, its temples repurposed, its rituals forgotten. And yet, spend time in modern China, and you start to notice something strange. The old system isn't as dead as advertised. The writing system is the same, not similar, the same. A scholar from the Han Dynasty could read a modern Chinese newspaper with effort. The characters have simplified slightly, but the bones are unchanged. This is not true of any other major language on Earth. Modern English speakers cannot read Beowulf. Modern Greek speakers struggle with Homer. Chinese has maintained its continuity across 2,000 years of political upheaval, foreign conquest, and deliberate revolutionary destruction. The bureaucratic culture survived. Beneath the Communist Party's ideology lies a government that would be recognizable to a Tang Dynasty administrator. Vast, hierarchical, staffed by competitive examination, the Gaokao replaces the imperial exams. Obsessed with documentation and correct procedure, fundamentally convinced that the state's job is to manage society for society's own good. The philosophy changed, the machinery didn't. The territorial boundaries survived. Modern China's claim to Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, partial. The Qing ruled all of Mongolia, the PRC only Inner Mongolia. These are Qing conquests, inherited by a government that officially repudiates the Qing dynasty. The Communist Party rules an empire assembled by the Manchu emperors it denounces as foreign oppressors. The contradiction is awkward. No one talks about it. The mandate logic survived, and the Communist Party doesn't claim heaven's favor. It claims historical inevitability, scientific socialism, the laws of dialectical materialism. But the practical test is the same. The party rules because it delivers prosperity and stability. If it stops delivering, its legitimacy will collapse, and everyone knows it. The performance-based test that the Zhou invented 3,000 years ago is still running, just with different vocabulary. The family system survived. Ancestor worship continues, slightly disguised. The emphasis on education, on filial piety, on maintaining family honor across generations. These are Confucian values absorbed so deeply into Chinese culture that they outlasted both the emperors who promoted them and the revolutionaries who tried to destroy them. The ghost is everywhere, once you know how to look. Here's the verdict the story has been building toward for 2 hours. The dynasty cycle was China's curse and salvation. Curse, because it meant endless repetition. The same rise, the same rot, the same collapse, the same reconstruction over and over for 3,000 years. No escape, no evolution beyond the pattern. Every dynasty believed it had solved the problem. Every dynasty was wrong, but salvation too, because the cycle meant that collapse was never final. The Han fell, and the idea of the Han survived to be rebuilt by the Tang. The Tang fell, and the idea of the Tang survived to be rebuilt by the Song. Over and over, the pieces scattered and reassembled, the same shape emerging from the chaos like a crystal reforming from a solution. Other empires died and left corpses. Rome fell and fragmented into pieces that became Spain, France, Italy, Romania, separate nations, separate languages, separate identities, never to reunify. China fell and somehow remembered that it was supposed to be one thing. The memory persisted through centuries of division. The pattern persisted through foreign conquest. When the Mongols were driven out, China returned. When the Manchus fell, China returned. The shape was stronger than any dynasty that tried to hold it. Why? Because the formula wasn't just a system of government. It was a story about what civilization means. The Confucian order taught that proper relationships create proper society. The examination system taught that education was the path to power. The mandate of heaven taught that rulers are judged by results. The writing system created a shared identity across impossible distances and incomprehensible time spans. A scholar in Guangzhou and a scholar in Beijing, 2,000 miles apart, could read each other's work. A scholar in 200 AD and a scholar in 1800 AD could read each other's work. The continuity wasn't accidental. It was engineered. China invented the idea that a civilization could be held together by texts rather than blood, by examinations rather than inheritance, by shared ideas rather than shared ancestors. This was the innovation that Rome never made, that Greece never imagined, that no Bronze Age civilization came close to achieving. And it worked. For 3,000 years, against every historical force that should have torn it apart, it worked. The price was the cycle, the endless repetition, the millions who died every time the formula failed and had to be rebuilt, the creativity and diversity that were sacrificed to maintain the unity. The formula worked, but it worked by suppression as much as by integration. The burden of holding it all together crushed every dynasty that tried. Return now to where we began. A farmer in rural China burns paper money at his grandfather's grave. The ritual is 3,000 years old. The language he speaks would be recognizable to a Han Dynasty official, different in pronunciation, but the same in structure. His family name appears in records from the Tang Dynasty. The bones of his ancestors have been buried in this village since before Europe had nations. Every other Bronze Age civilization is dead. Egypt, Babylon, Greece, museum pieces, archaeological sites, stories we tell about people utterly unlike us. But China is still here, not unchanged. Nothing that survives 3,000 years is unchanged. But continuous in a way no other civilization can claim. The thread stretches back to the oracle bones and forward to the gleaming cities, and it is never fully broken. The paradox from the opening was not a paradox at all. China survived because it fell apart, because the cycle of collapse and reconstruction, repeated over millennia, created something stronger than any single dynasty. The formula failed every few centuries, and every failure was an opportunity to rebuild, to incorporate, to adapt. The Yanbei became Chinese. The Mongol century connected China to the world. The Manchus created the borders we know today. Each catastrophe was a crucible, and what emerged was tempered harder than before. The dynasty is dead. The civilization is not. The Communist Party rules a country built on Qing conquests, staffed by examination graduates, governed through a bureaucracy that Confucius would recognize, haunted by 3,000 years of expectations about what China is supposed to be. The formula survives, adapted, disguised, denied, but present. Whether this is triumph or tragedy depends on what you value. The continuity cost lives beyond counting. Every dynasty's collapse, every civil war, every famine caused by the system's failures. The unity suppressed alternatives, philosophies that might have flourished. diversities that were erased, possibilities that were closed off. China is glorious and it is terrible, and both truths are the same truth, and neither can be separated from the other. The Great Wall stretches across the mountains, crumbling in places where no tourists visit. Stones have fallen. Trees grow through the gaps. The watchtowers are empty, the garrisons gone, the purpose obsolete. It was built to keep the outside world out, and the outside world came anyway, came by sea while China watched the north, came with ideas that the wall could never have stopped. But the land the wall was built to protect is still there, still recognizable, still called by the same name, still governed from the same center, still wrestling with the same impossible question that the first emperors faced. How do you hold this much together? 3,000 years, 20-some dynasties, hundreds of millions of lives, and the question still has no final answer. Only the pattern, rising and falling, scattering and reassembling, dying and returning, the cycle that is curse and salvation both, the ghost that refuses to rest. China endures,